First tonight, the US Vice President J.D. Vance is due to visit Greenland today, where he'll receive a briefing on Arctic security at the remote American military base. Plans for the trip were changed after people in the Danish territory reacted angrily to President Trump's repeated assertion that he would seek to annex it. Correspondents say the vice president's visit is being interpreted as connected to Mr. Trump's ambition, which is to take over Greenland as U.S. territory for security reasons, as Russia and America vie for military dominance in the Arctic. They say that President Trump's refusal to use force to take over the territory has sparked both fear and criticism in Greenland. For now, Greenland is a semi-autonomous part of Denmark, which colonized the territory hundreds of years ago and is one of America's NATO allies. Well, for his assessment, I'm joined now on the line from London by the international affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Good to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. So a very high-level delegation of Americans visiting a remote military base on Greenland. Do you agree with those who say it's the latest manifestation of America's designs on semi-autonomous Danish territory?
Yes, that is precisely what it is. It's a huge political signal that Donald Trump, president, wants to take over Greenland. That is the point of the visit.
Now, President Trump has, of course, repeatedly claimed that taking control of Greenland is essential for U.S. security. And interestingly, that assertion seems to have got the nod of approval from the Russian President Vladimir Putin, who said that the U.S. ambition to take over Greenland had long-standing historical roots, and that Russia thinks that the U.S. plan to acquire the territory is serious. I mean, what do you make of what Mr. Putin has said?
Well, first and foremost, it's just an excuse on President Trump's part that has something to do with national security. What he really means is he needs all the mineral wealth that Greenland has, and that's what he's actually interested in. However, in politics, any old excuse will do as a causus belli, or in this case, a causus taking over, so to speak. What is interesting is that President Putin has given him the green light. Now, the implication is quite clear. They've made a deal. The deal would be that President Putin keeps all his gains in Ukraine. That's presumably what there is in mind. And in return, President Trump can get hold of Greenland. It is that sort of deal, the quiet side of all these negotiations we don't hear about, that years later, when we do, the most famous or most notorious being the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which partitioned Poland in 1939, which was hidden for many years. Until we get to see all these private negotiations, we won't know, but it would appear to be along those lines. After all, this would explain why President Donald Trump is simply not pressing for President Putin to make any sort of concessions at all, but rather seems to be saying to President Putin he can keep all the territory.
I have to say that is a really interesting line that you've taken there, and I'd like to kind of move along that trajectory a bit more, because it's interesting that the Russian leader who spoke whilst visiting the Arctic himself warned that geopolitical battles in the region were intensifying, and an example of that was Donald Trump's plan to annex Greenland. But the Russian leader pointedly, as you said, did not criticize the American move. And your contention is that that has something to do with the war in Ukraine.
Yes, I'll go further. President Donald Trump, it would appear, has no interest in being leader of the Western world. And also on top of that, he seems to above all favor bilateral negotiations. He's by no means the only president, the only country that does that. But the point is that America, up till date, has been different. This being the case, it's what President Putin says, which is so important for Greenland and for anything else. And as a sign of that, there's the obverse of that, if you like, is this refusal now by President Donald Trump to pay for the World Trade Organization. In other words, he's just not interested in these, if you like, global or multilateral agreements. He's going on the old-fashioned basis that he works with a country like Russia, gives him a free hand, and therefore he can do what he likes, and Russia can do what it likes in its sphere of influence.
And just tell us a bit about the significance of the Arctic, which feels like it's a world away from everything, but is a region with its own geopolitical undercurrents, isn't it?
Well, yes, it's been kind of left out of it. In the Cold War, it was left out of it. Reykjavik, for example, was the scene of the summits. It was seen as a neutral territory. Well, President Donald Trump has changed all that, as he's changed so many other things. And now, basically, the Arctic is up for grabs and up for partition. Exactly where the partition lies with Russia, which, after all, has a huge coastline bordering the Arctic Ocean. Please note, the longest in the world around that ocean. Exactly where the partition will be is hard to say at present, but there are many resources there. We now have the technology to not only mine, of course, in the cold of Greenland, but in the seas surrounding it, the Arctic Ocean. And therefore, it would appear now to be at the moment when America, so to speak, has an opportunity to seize the area, along with Russia perhaps taking more of the Arctic Ocean, and they're dividing them more or less between themselves. Now, this, of course, would give both countries a huge boost, essentially America more than Russia, because Russia already has a great many raw materials, but America's hungry for ever more, and it would see this, I think, above all, as a way of trying to loosen its dependence upon China, which is one area which provides it with some important raw materials.
Again, very interesting analysis. So essentially, with these new partnerships and new alliances, is it beginning to feel like the old world order is cracking and that it is the Kremlin and the White House who are breaking it?
Yes. Essentially, the key move was by Washington, not by the Kremlin. It's happened before, by the way, in history. There was the famous diplomatic revolution of 1745, where France ceased to support Poland and Sweden, and in fact changed to supporting Austria and Russia. So this revolution, which is taking place now, has antecedents. Moreover, precisely as you say, this would change the world order, and in fact it's now heading quite clearly to a different world order, one in which Russia has a bigger role. It's no longer unipolar, it's multipolar. And for that matter, China, of course, is a recognized third important nation. And the losers in this are NATO. Please note, I don't think Donald Trump has ever mentioned NATO. And certainly, although Denmark is America's ally, as you rightly pointed out, he seems to take no interest in that whatsoever. So the loser is NATO. And of course, Europe. Please note, Europe used to be America's partner and now isn't. Not at least the closest partner, and arguably, if Europe comes out with more hostile comments, especially in the trade war against America, then pretty soon the relationship between them will cool enormously. So there are losers in this new setup, but it would appear absolutely that the old world order is crumbling, and if it carries on this way, within this year, it will have gone.
And given all that you've said and the fact that this American high-level delegation is visiting Greenland without an invitation, and of course in the context of those wider comments by President Trump, I mean, how are Greenlanders reacting to all of this?
Well, Greenland will see the threat, but unfortunately there's very little it can do. The reason is, you see, that if Russia and America agree, then frankly no one else in the region has much an opportunity to dissuade the Americans from doing whatever they want to do. I think one of the most significant aspects is the visit by the American Vice President is without an invitation. He's simply going to visit his own base. Sure, the base is located in another country, but they're not showing any sort of qualms about doing so, and this is a very strong signal. What the Greenlanders have now is a very real problem on their hands. There are very few of them. The territory is very big. The only support for their actions coming from Europe, but as I said just a moment ago, Europe's no longer number two, no longer America's closest ally. And in this respect, the situation is fairly difficult for them. Certainly, in the immediate future, there is no force which is compelling President Donald Trump to react differently. Please note, he's still thinking the same way about Canada, and as far as I could tell, the Panama Canal. And so therefore, as things stand, there is a threat for the people of Greenland.
And what about Denmark's reaction to all of this? Greenland, of course, as you pointed out, a semi-autonomous territory of Denmark and has representation inside the Danish parliament. So I would imagine that it's out of the question for Denmark to allow Greenland to become part of the United States.
Well, the interesting aspect of this all is, as you say, Denmark won't allow it. Greenland doesn't want it. But supposing Donald Trump just goes ahead and does it, in that respect, any moral argument against Russia disappears straight away because he's doing precisely what President Putin's doing. And moreover, as a secondary, there is no force to stop him. And therefore, all that we'll see is the Denmark saying, as in Ukraine saying, they refuse to accept the new reality. Of course, in Ukraine's sense of the part of its territory being occupied by Russia. And that's about it. There's not even a possibility of a fight. So therefore, Donald Trump has absolutely got every possibility. And as things stand, he certainly would appear to be making moves to acquire Greenland by one way or another.
And broadly speaking, Dr. Laskiewicz, how concerning is it for the rest of the world that the Americans and the Russians seem to be forming a partnership? Obviously, it's most concerning for Ukraine, and I would expect that the rest of the world would be concerned about territory in Ukraine being given to Russia, and then the US potentially taking territory from other places. I mean, is it hard to recognize what the US seems to be becoming at the moment?
No, it's quite interesting because the world just simply has gotten used to a different USA, and if you like, a somewhat unusual lull between what was quite usual beforehand. Please note, it's 100 years ago, more or less, but it was quite common for countries to attack each other and to seize their territory. Italy attacked Abyssinia, for example, in the 1930s under Mussolini. And so therefore, what we're seeing is, if you like, a return to the old politics where might is right. And certainly in this world order, the reason why some countries have got to be concerned is if Russia wins in Ukraine, as it would appear to be the case, then Russia has other scores to settle. Please note, the scores to settle are the Baltics and above all Poland. It wants the Suwalki corridor, for example. And therefore, with a rampant Russia and America disinterested in Europe's fate, the situation will be very difficult. And indeed, in my books, that's what I predicted, albeit not in precisely this way. And it would result in there being a European war closer to home, I anticipate, on Polish soil, indeed quite possibly even a nuclear one, because Russia can win that. The sole force controlling Russia is America. And if America doesn't want to play its part in stopping the Russians, then the Russians can move forward. Equally, the other question is that China, for example, is exerting itself not only about Taiwan, but in the other areas. And it follows quite logically, if America can expand, well, there's no obvious reason why China itself can't claim areas. You see, once you allow the world to go back to a stage of anarchy, then there are no rules as such. There's international cooperation agreement which can be torn up tomorrow, as indeed the 1994 treaty guaranteeing Ukraine, signed amongst others by America, is now simply consigned to history. Just another piece of paper.
That's a very worrying, rather dystopian-looking world that you point out there. But one quick word about Ukraine before we let you go. I mean, we heard a few hours ago that Washington has dismissed a suggestion from President Putin that Ukraine could be placed under a transitional administration under the auspices of the United Nations. I wonder what your reaction is to that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's Putin trying it on, so to speak. I don't think it's fatal for their relationship, the American and Russian one. He's made a suggestion, in effect. The key point about the suggestion, though, it's got a hidden edge to it. The main edge is, of course, the UN bit, which, of course, was dismissed. But underneath it, there was an opportunity for Putin again, and this was stated in many of the world's media, to point out that in his view, President Zelensky has no mandate, no authority to rule. And I think this was the main point about it all. It was an opportunity for Russia to once again try to undermine President Zelensky. And I think it should be seen in that light and not as an absolutely serious thought or proposition, to be more accurate, on President Putin's side.
Well, I thank you very much indeed for your analysis, and I wish you a jolly good weekend. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz is the international affairs analyst who was talking to me on the line there from London.